America's most decorated war hero, Audie Murphy, drew in 0.19 seconds, leaving everyone at Iverson Movie Ranch trembling. America's most decorated soldier had just demonstrated why he'd survived combat that killed better men, speed born from necessity, not training. Then Steve McQueen stepped into the California sun, looked directly into those war-hardened eyes, and proved that a man with nothing to lose could be faster than a man with everything to protect. The desert wind suddenly carried the scent of something more dangerous than gunpowder. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy. October 1961. Iverson Movie Ranch, Chatsworth, California, the sacred ground where Hollywood had manufactured its mythology of the American West for 4 decades. Red dust settled on everything like fine powder, coating leather holsters and making metal surfaces too hot to touch under the merciless October sun. Giant rock formations jutted from the earth like monuments to geological forces that had shaped this terrain millions of years before cameras discovered its cinematic potential. This was neutral territory, where legends tested themselves against each other in the democracy of shared skill and mutual respect, where reputation meant nothing and capability was the only currency that mattered, where 2 different approaches to violence could meet and measure themselves without the diplomatic constraints of professional courtesy or studio politics. Audie Murphy, 36 years old, stood in the shade of a massive boulder that had served as backdrop for countless gunfights between actors who'd never faced real bullets fired with lethal intent. Fresh from completing morning scenes for 6 Black Horses, the Western that would add another entry to his filmography of roles that never quite captured the reality of what he'd experienced in actual combat. Wearing dusty work clothes that made him look more like a ranch hand than America's most decorated World War II soldier. His baby face carried the kind of innocence that had made casting directors typecast him as the young hero in dozens of films. But his eyes held something that no makeup artist could create, and no acting coach could teach: the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd killed men in combat and watched friends die in ways that Hollywood would never accurately portray. Those eyes had seen the liberation of concentration camps, the reality of hand-to-hand combat, and the difference between movie violence and the kind that left permanent scars on human souls. Steve McQueen, 31 years old, emerged from the production trailer of The Hell Is for Heroes, the war film that would ironically pair him with another combat veteran in a story about soldiers who understood that survival often depended more on attitude than equipment. Wearing a simple white t-shirt and jeans that somehow managed to look more dangerous than any elaborate costume designer could create. His pale blue eyes carried the restless energy of someone who treated every day like an opportunity to prove something to himself and the world. 2 different kinds of experience meeting on ground that had witnessed more staged violence than any real battlefield, but understanding that what they were about to test was authentic regardless of the setting. The afternoon heat was building toward dangerous levels, making extended physical activity inadvisable for anyone who valued comfort over competition. But neither man had driven to this isolated location for comfort. They were here because word had spread through the Hollywood community about quick-draw demonstrations that separated genuine skill from movie magic, and both men had reputations that demanded validation through performance rather than publicity. "Audie," McQueen said, extending his hand in greeting to a man whose military service had earned him respect that no civilian achievement could match. "Steve, heard you've been practicing your draw technique for the new picture." "Some. Trying to make it look authentic for audiences who've seen every variation of Western gunfighting ever filmed." Authentic is harder than most people realize, especially when you're trying to convince people who've never held a real weapon in a real situation. McQueen nodded with understanding that came from his own military service, though his experience paled in comparison to Murphy's legendary combat record. "Want to see what passes for authentic in modern Hollywood? Always interested in observing different approaches to technique." But Murphy's tone suggested that he understood the difference between technique designed for cameras and skills developed through encounters where mistakes were measured in body counts rather than retakes. His approach to firearms had been forged in combat situations where being second fastest meant not going home, and that kind of training left marks that peaceful practice could never replicate. McQueen drew his weapon with the smooth precision that had taken months of dedicated practice to develop. Clean movement that prioritized speed without sacrificing accuracy. The kind of draw that would photograph beautifully and impress audiences who expected their heroes to demonstrate superior capability through superior technique. Not bad, Murphy acknowledged. How long have you been working on that? 6 months of daily practice, 2 hours every morning before shooting starts. Shows. Your form is clean, your speed is respectable, and your accuracy looks consistent. But Murphy smiled with the kind of understanding that came from having survived situations that most people only experienced in nightmares. But you're performing. Demonstrating mastery of mechanical processes that serve cinematic purposes. And you think there's a difference? I know there's a difference. Murphy positioned himself at the informal firing line that had been established in the shadow of rocks that had witnessed more movie gunfights than any real frontier town. But his stance carried none of McQueen's studied precision or theatrical awareness. Just natural readiness that somehow suggested more danger than all of McQueen's technical perfection. Steve, watch this. And understand that what you're about to see isn't technique. It's survival reflex. Murphy drew his weapon. What happened next challenged every assumption about the relationship between training and capability, between performance and lethality, between Hollywood violence and the kind that actually killed people in real combat situations. Murphy's hand materialized around his Colt .45 as if it had teleported there. No visible movement that human eyes could track and analyze. No balletic grace or studied positioning. Just instantaneous transition from stillness to lethal readiness that made McQueen's careful technique look like elaborate theater performance. The gun fired 3 times before the sound of the first shot had finished echoing across the ranch. 3 holes appeared in the distant target, grouped so tightly they could be covered with a playing card. The weapon disappeared back into leather before McQueen's nervous system could process the beginning of the sequence. The chronometer displayed 0.19 seconds. Complete silence settled over the ranch like a blanket thrown over sudden violence. Set workers who had been arranging equipment stopped to stare at Murphy with expressions that mixed professional appreciation with something that looked like fear. This wasn't just fast. This was superhuman capability applied to lethal purpose with mechanical efficiency. Jesus Christ, one of the grips whispered. Murphy reholstered without ceremony or satisfaction. Different kind of training, Steve. Different kind of necessity. McQueen stared at the target, then at Murphy, then at the chronometer that had recorded human performance that exceeded normal limitations. 19/100ths of a second. Combat doesn't give you time to think about technique. You react or you die. After a while, reaction becomes automatic. How many times did you use that speed in combat? Murphy's expression shifted slightly, accessing memories that no Hollywood script would ever accurately portray. Often enough to stay alive when better men didn't. The weight of that statement settled between them like smoke from expensive cigars. McQueen understood that he was in the presence of someone who'd applied these skills under conditions that transformed technique into survival and practice into life-or-death reality. Audie, that speed comes from experience I hope I never have to gain. Experience nobody should have to gain. But once you have it, it changes how you approach everything, including civilian situations that most people think are just entertainment. Such as understanding that real gunfights aren't competitions. They're elimination contests, where second place means permanent elimination. McQueen removed his hat, wiping sweat that came from desert heat mixed with the psychological impact of witnessing capability that exceeded his own by margins he couldn't close through practice alone. That's sobering perspective. War tends to provide sobering perspective about most things, including the difference between playing tough and being tough. And you think I'm playing tough? Murphy considered the question with the careful attention he applied to all serious topics. I think you're developing toughness through choice rather than necessity, which might be more valuable in the long run. How so? Because chosen toughness can be controlled and directed. Necessary toughness sometimes controls the person instead of serving them. McQueen understood that Murphy was describing something about the cost of combat experience that no medal or commendation could capture. Skills that saved lives but carried psychological prices that peaceful people never had to pay. Audie, can I show you something? Sure. Not technique, attitude. McQueen positioned himself at the firing line, but his approach looked nothing like Murphy's natural combat readiness or his own practiced precision. Instead, he adopted a stance that carried no preparation or optimization, just the casual confidence of someone who understood that some contests were worth entering, regardless of the odds against winning. What you showed me was speed born from survival necessity, professional capability developed through encounters that demanded results regardless of cost. Correct. This is speed born from having nothing to lose. Amateur capability developed through willingness to risk everything for temporary satisfaction. Murphy understood that McQueen was describing something fundamentally different from combat training. Not skill developed through necessity, but attitude cultivated through choice. Not survival reflex, but calculated recklessness applied to situations where the stakes were measured in pride rather than blood. "Show me," Murphy said. McQueen drew his weapon with movement that carried none of Murphy's military precision but somehow suggested equal danger through completely different means. Where Murphy's speed came from training that had been burned into his nervous system through repeated exposure to lethal situations, McQueen's speed came from psychological commitment that eliminated hesitation through indifference to consequences. The draw was fast, not as fast as Murphy's combat-trained reflexes, but fast enough to suggest that conventional training wasn't the only path to dangerous capability. The shots were accurate, not with Murphy's mechanical precision, but with enough consistency to prove that natural talent could sometimes compensate for lack of combat experience. Interesting approach, Murphy acknowledged. Different source of confidence. You're fast because you've learned that hesitation gets people killed. I'm fast because I've decided that getting killed isn't worse than living carefully. Recklessness versus experience. Commitment versus survival. Both authentic for different reasons. Murphy studied McQueen with the analytical attention he'd once applied to enemy positions and tactical situations. "Steve, your attitude is dangerous, not just to opponents but to yourself." "Maybe, but it's honest. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not based on experiences I've never had. And you think that makes your approach more authentic than mine? I think it makes my approach more honest about what it is and where it comes from. You're fast because war taught you to be fast. I'm fast because peace bores me." The distinction hung in the air like gun smoke, revealing fundamental differences in motivation that led to superficially similar results through completely different psychological pathways. "Audie," McQueen continued, "what you demonstrated was professional excellence developed through necessity. Survival skills that kept you alive in situations where amateur approaches got people killed. Correct? What I'm offering is amateur excellence developed through choice. Recreational skills that serve no practical purpose except personal satisfaction. And you think both approaches have equal validity?" McQueen smiled with the kind of confidence that came from understanding his own limitations without being constrained by them. "I think they serve different purposes for different kinds of men in different kinds of situations." "Such as?" "Your skills serve men who need to survive encounters with people who want to kill them. My skills serve men who need to survive encounters with boredom, comfort, and the kind of safety that makes life feel like death." Murphy laughed, the first genuine expression of humor he'd shown since the demonstration began. "That's an interesting way to frame the distinction. It's an honest way. You develop speed to stay alive. I develop speed to feel alive, both necessary for different kinds of survival." As the afternoon sun climbed toward dangerous levels, both men understood that their conversation had moved beyond quick-draw technique to fundamental questions about motivation, authenticity, and the different ways men could respond to the challenges of their respective circumstances. "Steve," Murphy said as they prepared to return to their respective film sets, "your speed is impressive. Really. And your attitude is educational." "How so?" "Because it reminds me that not all dangerous capabilities come from dangerous experiences. Sometimes they come from dangerous personalities applied to safe circumstances." "And sometimes," McQueen replied, "the most dangerous thing about a man isn't what he's survived, but what he's willing to risk when he doesn't have to." The two men shook hands in the shadow of rocks that had witnessed this exchange between different approaches to the same fundamental challenge, demonstrating that some people possessed capabilities that exceeded normal limitations, regardless of how those capabilities had been acquired. Murphy returned to his Western set, carrying with him renewed understanding of how civilian skills could achieve professional results through different pathways than military training provided. McQueen returned to his war film, understanding that some forms of courage were learned through necessity while others were chosen through character. Both men had been changed by the encounter in ways that would influence every future performance. Murphy had seen that combat experience wasn't the only source of authentic toughness. McQueen had seen that chosen toughness could coexist with earned toughness, without either diminishing the other. The desert wind continued to blow across landscape that cared nothing for human definitions of courage, skill, or authenticity. But two men who'd tested themselves against each other had discovered that respect could exist between different approaches to the same fundamental challenge, proving that some people were willing to do what circumstances demanded, regardless of what those circumstances were or where they came from. America's most decorated war hero Audie Murphy drew in 0.19 seconds and left everyone trembling, until Steve McQueen looked directly into those war-hardened eyes and proved the speed of a man with nothing to lose. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.